I still remember how proud my son sounded on the phone, the kind of pride that makes a mother stand a little taller. So I baked a small batch of cookies, drove across town, walked into that gleaming lobby, and what I saw in the back corridor turned my heart cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I simply set the cookie box down, turned around, stepped outside, and called the one person who could change everything. Thank you for watching. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Mary, and I live in Alaska. And as I sat in my car, with the phone cooling in my hand after that call, the taste of disappointment sat heavy on my tongue like metal. Because an hour earlier, I had walked into that building with a box of warm cookies and quiet pride, telling myself not to embarrass my son, not to fuss, just to smile and wish him luck before slipping away. Yet the moment I stepped past the lobby and followed that narrow corridor with its bright lights and harsh smell of cleaning fluid, something inside me went still. I heard laughter. I saw a tie being straightened like a little crown. And I saw my son trying to swallow his shame as if swallowing could make it disappear. And in that instant, all the years of teaching him to work hard, to keep his hands steady, to be kind, even when kindness was not returned, rose up like a shield around him. So I placed the cookie box down and chose silence, because I knew that any word I spoke would be used to bruise him further. And I carried that silence with me through the glass doors and into the open air where the sky looked colder than it felt. And I told myself to breathe, to remember who I am and where I come from. A woman who has learned that strength can be quiet and that love can be strategic. And that is why I scrolled to a number I had not pressed in years and called the only person with the power to make men who laugh at other people's pain sit up straight. Because I was not going to argue in a hallway. I was going to change the room where decisions are made. Tom answered on the second ring, his voice older and careful, and I told him what I had just seen without raising my tone. I said that I had walked into that building with warm cookies and a proud heart, and walked out carrying a silence that felt heavier than stone. And I reminded him of the year when the company was small and shivering, and my late husband, and he kept it alive with patient money and long nights. And how the papers they signed gave him the strength to steady the ship when others forgot who helped them. And I asked for nothing dramatic, only the truth to be seen in full daylight, the way a winter sky in Alaska shows every ridge and shadow. And he listened without interrupting, then asked for the date, the time, and the exact corridor. And I could hear the scratch of his pen and the weight of his decision settling. And I told him I did not beg for a position. I did not want favors. I only wanted dignity, placed where it belonged. Because I had watched my son hold his breath so he would not cry in front of people who enjoyed watching him break. And I knew that if I spoke in that hallway they would call me loud. But if I spoke through the record and the rules they would have to call me, right? So I gave him every detail down to the harsh smell of bleach and the way a tie was straightened like a little crown before an insult. And when he said he would look into it at once, I thanked him and sat very still, listening to the soft tick of the car's dashboard and the wind moving over the lot, and I felt a calm settle over me. Not victory, not yet. Just the quiet strength that comes when you push one careful stone and the whole wall starts to understand. It can no longer lean on your silence. Driving away, I let the heater hum and let my hands settle on the wheel. And in that quiet, I thought about the day my husband and Tom shook hands in a small office that smelled of coffee and paper dust. Two men betting on a company that could fail by Friday if someone did not love it hard enough. And I remembered how we agreed to keep our names soft and our promises firm so that the people who needed the spotlight could have it, while the people who kept the lights on stayed steady in the back. And I also remembered a wedding toast that stung like ice when a clever man praised my son's smile, but joked about his future as if ambition did not live behind gentle eyes. And how I chose not to answer, because I believed character would speak louder in time. And now, as the winter sky stretched pale over Alaska, I realized that time had spoken, and it needed a witness. So I pulled into my driveway, carried the cooling cookie box to the counter, and stood very still, while the house clicked and settled around me. Then my phone lit up with a brief message from Tom asking me to confirm the exact hour and the camera location near the service corridor. And when I sent it, he replied that he would request the footage and the audio files, and that he would also have someone speak quietly to the people who usually stay quiet, the assistants and the janitors and the reception staff who see everything yet are seen by no one. And I felt a slow warmth replace the cold in my chest, because this was not drama. This was process, and process is how you lift a stone and find the truth living underneath it. And while I waited, I brewed tea and walked the length of my kitchen, the way I used to walk with a crying newborn, whispering patience to the air, telling myself that love does not need to shout to be strong, and that I would not meet cruelty with spectacle. I would meet it with sunlight and signatures. And when the phone buzzed again, it was only a short note that said, "We will talk tomorrow morning. Mary, sleep if you can." And I answered thank you, and set the phone face down, because I knew this was the last night that shame would sleep in my son's hands without an answer. Morning came pale and quiet, and I stood at the window with my tea while the frost wrote its thin handwriting across the glass. When the phone rang, I answered on the first breath and heard Tom say that the request had been accepted. The recordings were being pulled, and that he would need a clear statement from me to sit beside what the cameras already saw. So I told him everything again, with the same calm I used the night before. The time I arrived, the turn down the narrow corridor, the words that were said with a laugh that did not belong in any workplace, the way my son tried to steady himself, the way I set the cookies down and chose to leave rather than feed anyone's appetite for a scene. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said that my steadiness would help more than I knew, because courage without noise is hard to ignore when it sits next to evidence that cannot blink. He told me that a few people had already agreed to speak once they knew their names would be protected. Reception staff, an assistant who kept schedules, a maintenance worker who had heard enough to fill a notebook. And he said there were also written complaints tucked away in drawers that would now be brought to the light. He did not promise fireworks. He promised policy and due process. He said that words like respect and safety and culture would be read aloud at a long table where no one could shrug them off. He asked if I wanted my son informed right then, and I told him no, not yet, because I did not want to put hope on his shoulders before it had a place to land. I wanted him to finish his day with his head up and let the change come to him like weather that clears without thunder. And after we hung up, I opened the cookie tin and smiled at the quiet way sugar holds together. I packed a small lunch for myself just to keep my hands moving. And I thought about the difference between punishing and correcting, about how what I needed was not revenge but a room where decency was the measure. I sent Tom a short note with every detail spelled the same way, twice, so nothing could be twisted. My full name, my location in Alaska, the timestamps, the description of everyone present. And he replied that an emergency session would be scheduled and that I should keep my phone close. I set the phone down and walked from room to room, feeling the weight lift grain by grain. Because this was not a storm to be met with shouting. This was a tide that would quietly move the boats to their rightful depth. And I whispered to myself that patience is not weakness when it's paired with a spine and a record. Then I sat at the table and wrote a single line on a piece of paper to steady my heart. Today, I will not chase anyone. I will let the truth find its chair. By the next afternoon, the sky had softened and the phone rang again. Tom's voice steady but with a note of something heavier. He said the footage was worse than either of us expected. There were more moments, small and cruel, that had piled up over months, and the board had seen enough to call an immediate meeting. He told me not to worry, that the process was in motion and that my part was done. And as I hung up, I sat for a while with my hands folded, thinking about how quiet victories arrive, not with cheers or headlines, but with stillness. Like snow covering ground that has been trampled too long. I thought of my son finishing his shift, not knowing the ground beneath him was already changing. And for the first time in many nights I felt my chest loosen, because silence, when it is chosen, can build walls strong enough to carry justice on its back. That evening, I kept the lights low and let the house breathe, while the wind traced the eaves. I thought about every time I told my son that work is not a stage for someone else's pride, but a place where hands and minds earn respect, one honest hour at a time. I remembered him polishing his shoes before school and promising he would make me proud. And I smiled because he already had long before this office, and its polished floors tried to make him smaller. I took out a small notebook and wrote the names of the people who had ever opened a door for me when I felt unseen. The teacher who stayed late, the neighbor who shoveled my steps when the snow was higher than my knees, the clerk who once called after me because I had forgotten my wallet on the counter. And I let those memories steady my breathing. Because kindness is a lineage, and I wanted to make sure I carried it forward, even as I asked for hard things to be set right. I checked my phone only once, and then turned it face down. I made soup and ate slowly. I washed the bowl and set it to dry. And I kept telling myself that I did not want spectacle tomorrow. I wanted order, signatures, and the quiet correction that teaches people to keep their voices gentle, even when they hold power. I whispered a small prayer for the assistants and the reception staff, whose courage would be measured in recorded statements and not in applause. And I asked for steadiness for the board, so that no one would forget that dignity is not a favor. It is the floor we all stand on. Then I folded a clean handkerchief and placed it in my coat pocket for the morning. Not because I planned to weep, but because preparation is its own kind of love. I set my alarm, drew the curtains, and before I lay down, I looked once more at the cookie tin on the counter and thought about how sweetness waits, how it does not rush to be tasted. And I told myself that tomorrow I would walk into whatever room opened and I would say only what was necessary, no more, no less, because the truth had already found its chair. Morning broke clear and sharp, and I dressed with care, slipped the folded handkerchief into my coat pocket, locked the door, and drove through streets that glittered with thin ice. When I walked into the building this time, the receptionist stood a little straighter and called upstairs without delay. And a quiet man with a badge led me to a room where the table was long and the chairs were set in a careful circle. Tom was already there with a binder open and a pen resting on a page, and across from him sat two people from compliance and one from human resources. They greeted me by name and asked if I was comfortable. I said yes and kept my hands folded. And then the screen on the wall lit up and the footage began. The corridor came into view, the laughing voice, the insult, the way my son bent back into his work like he could hide inside it, and the room went very still. They paused the image, they rewound, they replayed the moments with dates and times stamped at the bottom of the frame. Then they opened a folder and read statements from staff who had kept their courage in envelopes for months. All of it specific, all of it steady, no shouting, no drama, just the facts that lived in their memory like a weight finally set down. They asked me to confirm my arrival time, the direction I walked, the words I heard, whether the box in the corner was a box of cookies I carried. And I said yes to each thing in the same even tone as the day before. Then I said one more line, that I did not want a favor for my son. I wanted a place where dignity was not optional, and I watched the compliance officer write those words exactly. After that, they spoke about policy and culture and duty to protect every person on the payroll. They spoke about how leadership sets the weather inside a company, and how storms are not an accident when a roof is neglected. And then they asked me to wait outside for a few minutes while they called in others. I sat on a small chair in the hall and listened to the faint click of a printer and the murmur of measured voices. I held the handkerchief but did not need it. I just breathed and told myself that this was not vengeance. This was repair. And when they asked me back in, Tom looked up and said that immediate steps would be taken, that the person who had laughed would be removed from his position while the board completed the formal process, that an interim leader would be named, and that there would be training and oversight so that arrogance could not pass for strength again. I nodded and said thank you, because sometimes gratitude is the right shape for relief. I did not call my son yet. I wanted the news to reach him in the proper order. through the people whose voices he had learned to respect inside those walls. And as I left the room, the same quiet man walked me to the elevator and said in a low voice that his mother lives far away and that he hoped someone like me would stand up for him if he ever needed it. I told him that standing up does not always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like sitting still until the truth arrives and takes a seat beside you. And when the doors opened and the cold air met my face, I felt lighter. Not triumphant, just steady. Because a house that has been cleaned with care does not smell of bleach. It smells of air and light and space to breathe. And that is what I carried with me back to the car. A clean breath and the knowledge that change had finally been invited into the room. By late afternoon, the air felt lighter, even though the clouds were thick, and I drove home without turning on the radio. I set my keys in the little bowl by the door, washed my hands, and stood at the sink letting the water run cool over my fingers while I tried to name the feeling in my chest. It was not triumph and it was not anger, it was steadiness. The kind that comes when you do the right thing and let it stand on its own feet. Then my phone buzzed, and I saw my son's name, and I answered with a smile. He could hear. His voice was small at first. He said there was a meeting upstairs and people were moving fast. He said someone from Human Resources asked him to come by before his shift ended. He sounded worried that maybe he had done something wrong by trying too hard to be invisible. And I told him to breathe, to finish the task in front of him. To walk into that office with his shoulders level and his eyes clear. I told him that work should never bruise a person's spirit, and that whatever news came next, he would meet it with the same dignity he carried even on the hardest day. He asked me if I knew anything, and I said only this, that truth works slowly and then all at once, and that today the slow work was ending. I could hear him calm by degrees. I could hear the soft scrape of a chair and the rustle of paper as if he were setting something down to make room for hope. And I told him I would be here when he finished, that he did not have to explain or apologize for anything, that there are moments in life when the world tries to tell you who you are, and your only job is to stand still long enough for your real name to be heard. He said he would call me after the meeting. He thanked me for dropping off cookies even though he had not tasted a single one. And I said they would keep until tomorrow, because sweetness has patience. Then we said goodbye, and I set the phone on the table and sat with my hands folded. I watched the pale light move across the floor, and I thought about how many people had carried small pieces of courage into that building today. Statements typed with shaking hands, memories spoken in low voices, signatures written in neat lines, and I whispered a thank you for every unseen person who told the truth, because without them doors do not open. And when the kettle clicked, I poured hot water over a fresh tea bag and stood very still, breathing steam, and letting the quiet tell me that change was already walking the halls where cruelty once walked loud. He called as the sun slid behind the clouds, his breath unsteady but his words clear. He said they had met with him in a small office and spoken gently, that the board had removed the man who laughed and named an interim leader, that he had been offered an entry-level office role with training and a mentor who believed in quiet hard work, and I told him to accept it with his chin level, and to remember that dignity does not ask permission to stand. He said he wished I were there, and I said I was. In every careful step he took from that hallway to that chair, and when we hung up, I sat with my tea cooling and felt a new kind of quiet. Not the heavy kind that hides pain, but the soft kind that comes when something wrong has finally been set right. The next morning, I ironed a clean shirt for myself, tucked the cookie tin under my arm, and drove back to the building with the kind of calm that does not need to announce itself. The receptionist smiled like she had been waiting for good news to have a face, and she pointed me toward a modest office, where my son sat at a simple desk with a notebook open and a pen ready. His shoulders were level, his eyes were clear. And when he looked up, the relief that moved across his face was so quiet and so bright that I had to hold my breath to keep from crying. I set the cookies down and told him, "This is a fresh box for a fresh start." He laughed the smallest laugh and said someone from his team had already shown him how to log into the system, how to file a report, how to ask questions without feeling small. And then the interim leader stopped by the doorway and thanked him for coming in early, for choosing steadiness over noise, for the way he had carried himself when it would have been easier to break. I said very little. I just listened. Because respect sounds better when it is spoken by people who can grant it and keep it. A moment later, Human Resources asked if they could speak to me privately. They thanked me for my clear statement, for trusting the process. They promised training and oversight so that no one would be left alone in a hallway with their dignity on the floor. And they asked if I had any requests. I said only this: let the work be the measure, and let kindness be the weather in this place. And when I stepped back into the corridor, I saw my son standing by the window, looking out at the lot where I had once sat with my hands shaking. He turned and said he felt like air could finally reach the bottom of his lungs. I told him that his worth did not begin at that desk, and it did not end there either. That it lives where his character lives, and that is why today feels different. As I walked toward the elevator, I passed a woman from the front desk who whispered thank you without moving her lips, and I nodded, because some gratitude is too tender to carry on a full voice. Outside, the air was crisp and honest. I held the empty cookie tin against my side and thought about how power used gently can still move mountains. I thought about the people who spoke up and signed their names, and I promised myself I would remember every one of them the next time someone tried to tell me that silence is the same as surrender. Because I had been silent in a hallway, yes, but I had not surrendered. I had simply chosen the room where truth could stand up straight. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, with the empty tin beside me, and let the quiet stretch. I thought about the first call, when his voice danced with pride, and about the hallway where my hands wanted to shake. And I thought about how today ended with a plain desk, a steady mentor, and a promise written in the way people spoke to him. I folded the handkerchief I never needed, and smiled, because sometimes strength is not the fire you throw, it is the warmth you keep. I poured a fresh cup of tea and told myself that what we fixed today was not only a job title, but the air a person breathes when they walk into a room. I whispered a thank you for every unseen witness who chose truth over comfort, and I decided I would sleep early, because tomorrow I would bring another small box of cookies and watch my son take his seat without lowering his eyes. And I would carry with me the simple lesson that love does not always push through doors. Sometimes it waits in the hallway until the right door opens, and then it walks in without raising its voice. In the morning light, I tied my scarf, packed a fresh box of cookies, and felt a calm I had not known in a long time. Because yesterday taught me that quiet can be strong, and that respect grows when truth is allowed to stand. I thought of my son at his desk, learning the work with steady hands and a clear mind. And I promised myself to keep choosing the room where decency leads and noise has no say. Thank you for staying with me till the end. If my story touched your heart, please subscribe and stay close for the next one.